Okay. Yes, no. Stop recording. Okay, so we're going. I think we're running, and you all are here. Hey, Tangy, no worries. So, hi, everyone. I wanted to tell you a story at the very beginning, because I do love stories. I think it was about 10 years ago, I had a woman come to see me because she wanted to be in a relationship. And she'd never had a relationship that lasted more than 2 years. And I said, what happens at 2 years? And she said, oh, I start to feel trapped and I have to leave. So we started doing some family history. And as we did the family history, it turned out she was one of 4 children. And it turned out she was kind of pipelined into her parents' relationship. Now, how this showed up was she started talking about her family and how her mother had really wanted to leave, but didn't. She stayed there for the children. And she talked on and on about how wonderful this was, that her mother, this saintly woman, had stayed for the children. How wonderful she had stayed for the children. But when we got a little deeper, it turned out this woman was completely pipelined into her mother's feelings of being trapped, of wanting to leave, but not being able to. And so what happened was anytime this woman would be in a relationship, after a certain amount of time, 2 years was the maximum she could do before the feeling of being trapped was so intense that she had to get out. Now, she was one of 4 children, like I said. Not a single one of those 4 children had had a relationship that lasted for more than 2 years. So this wonderful thing that her mother had done, this sacrifice that she had done, turned out to actually have a bad effect on the children, because unconsciously they pipelined into that feeling of trapped that she had. Another story I want to tell you, and then I'll tell you why this actually all makes sense, is I was doing a constellation, and in a little while I'll tell you what a constellation is, for a young man who was about 26 years old and had never had a relationship that lasted more than a month. He said, it's like I have relationship PTSD. Now, it's really interesting whenever someone uses that phrase with me, that I have PTSD, but they haven't actually been through a traumatic incident. It's almost always that they have imported the experience of someone in the family. So we did a constellation, which is a way of looking at generational effects. And in the constellation, we saw that where he was identified, where he was drawn, and it was to 2 of his great uncles. One of these great uncles had served in the United States Marines in the Second World War at Iwo Jima, which was just terrible. And he came home with horrific PTSD. And pretty much took it out on all his relationships. He basically burned up all his relationships, blew them up. The other great uncle had also been in the Second World War, but was in the American Army in Germany. And he was with the troops, the troops that actually liberated the concentration camp of Dachau. And so they were the first people to come there and see what had happened. And so after that, he was never the same. He came back and slowly drank himself to death. Now, my client, this 26-year-old male, would never have said, oh yeah, I'm sabotaging my relationships because of my great uncles. This woman would never have said, oh, I blow out of relationships because my mother felt trapped. But just below the surface, they were both having this pipelined into somebody else's experience. And this is something that human beings do all the time and almost never know about it. It's almost completely invisible, and yet it's what limits so much of our life, our health, our happiness, our money, and our love, especially our love. Hi, I'm Michelle Masters. I've been an NLP trainer for over 20 years at the renowned NLP Marin. And I've been doing family constellation work, which is a way of working with these unconscious dynamics, since 1996. Because it's a way of working with stuff that we haven't really found a great way to work anywhere else. And it's some of the biggest blocks that we as human beings face. So let me see if I can get this to work for you. Here we go. So, a couple of years ago, a man named Bert Hellinger who was actually, I'll show you Bert in a minute, but he saw the work of this woman, Virginia Satir. She was a famous author and psychotherapist in the United States, and she was doing some really groundbreaking new work called Family Constellations, is what she called it. And it was a way of using people, volunteers, representatives, to represent members of someone's family and see what kind of dynamics showed up. Now, Bert Hellinger saw her work and realized the brilliance of it, and he took it, and over the course of about 30 years, he really developed it into this way of opening a window into the unconscious family dynamics, generational dynamics. Now, there's really only two things that keep people stuck in life, two kinds of blocks. There's unconscious beliefs and identities. Identity is more beliefs. And there's unconscious family loyalties. And Bert Hellinger was the one who actually figured out a way, a beautiful, epic way of working with these unconscious family loyalties to release these generational patterns so that people could have more of the life and the love that they want. Because he saw how patterns in families would repeat. If there was a tragedy here, then often in the next generation or 2 generations down, it often skips one, that tragedy would somehow be replayed. And sometimes it replays for successive generations without the subsequent participants, the subsequent descendants, even realizing why they're having this experience. So this was the real gift that Bert Hellinger discovered. And in fact, now research is starting to confirm this. We always get a little nervous when research confirms that what we're doing is legitimate. We're so used to operating sort of outside or on the edge of what's already known. So when we start to get mainstream, I feel like I should dress better. But actually, there's quite a bit of research that's come out in the last few years, places like the Wall Street Journal, Discover Magazine, The Guardian, talking about how trauma can be passed down. Now, their explanation for it is in the genes. We don't know how it gets passed down, but I can tell you experientially that we see these patterns repeat over and over and over. Mark Wolin, who wrote this book, It Didn't Start With You, says, and I quote, "Emerging trends in psychotherapy are now beginning to point beyond the traumas of the individual to include traumatic events in the family and social history as part of the whole picture. Tragedies, varying in type and intensity, such as abandonment, suicide, and war, or the early death of a child, parent, or sibling, can send shock waves of distress cascading from one generation to the next. Recent developments in the field of cellular biology, neurobiology, epigenetics, and developmental psychology underscore the importance of exploring at least 3 generations of family history." 3 generations, in order to understand the mechanism behind patterns of trauma and suffering that repeat. Now, people often ask me, how could something I didn't even know about be affecting me? Because I didn't even know those people, I never met them, or sometimes there's an event in the family history that none of the participants know about, and yet it still affects them. Now, we don't exactly know the how, but our best guess is actually morphogenetic fields. Morphogenetic fields were based on the work of Rupert Sheldrake. So Rupert Sheldrake is a famous author and biologist, and he came up with this idea of morphogenetic fields. He began to notice that when there is a group or a system, when there's a system like a group of animals, a group of plants, a group of human beings, there's an organizing system, and he called it a morphogenic field that is affected by the participants and affects them, kind of like how they describe the Force in the Star Wars movies. But that the information in this field acts like a hologram. And so what is available to one in the hologram is available to everyone. Now, he came up with this theory, and then he went and watched Bert Hellinger work. And when he watched Bert Hellinger work, he said, you know what? I'm credited with coming up with this idea of morphogenetic fields, but I didn't actually believe it until I saw your work. So we're not exactly sure, but how it seems, the best metaphor I can think of how this seems to work is, well, I'll put the title of the book up later, but how this seems to work, if you have a magnet and you have iron shavings and you put them down and you let the magnet interact with the shavings, the iron shavings will line up in a pattern according to the magnet's electromagnetic field. It'll make a distinct pattern. And that pattern will be different with every magnet. You bring in another magnet, the shavings line up differently. Human families seem to operate in the same way. There is a field that we all bring with our families, that our families bring with us, that our families generate and also experience. And what it does is it causes us to recreate or organize our lives, our love, our health, our money, according to the field that we're in. And it is possible to have a life different from what the family field is, but it feels very difficult. And we'll come to why later. I could tell you, though, examples for days of how this affects people, of clients that I've worked with. I had a client come once to a constellation, and he said so cleanly, he said, I feel like I'm carrying this grief that's not my own. Now, when I did some family history, his father had been one of 8 children. And the family, when his father was 8 years old, the family got diphtheria. Everybody in the family got sick with diphtheria. And except for his father, everyone died. Both parents died, and his other 7 siblings died. And so there was no way this boy was all of a sudden bereft. And there's no way he could process that kind of grief. It's just too much. And so it goes into the family unconscious. And then the next generation signs up to try and help. I'll take it on, I'll heal it for you. Because I say this all the time, but there has never been a child born in the history of humanity who did not want to heal their families. There has also never been a child born in the history of humanity who's pulled it off. But we all take a crack at it. Our first move is always to try to love the pain into submission. I will love you so much that you will feel okay and it will all be better. And because that love is so enormous that we come in with, this feels reasonable, but it never works. If it worked, every parent would be instantly healed upon the birth of their first child. But it doesn't. And so the next move is often, okay, I will take the pain from you. I will have this for you. I will suffer so you can be okay. This also never works. If it did work, it might be worth it. Who knows? But it doesn't. It just now means there's one more person who's stuck in the same pain. And the last thing we do is we basically say, I won't have it too much better than you. If it was bad for you, it will be bad for me. Because when we have it better than the people we come from, we feel guilty. So I was recently talking to a woman whose grandmother, there was a grandmother who died of tuberculosis when her daughter was about 3. Now, when that daughter grew up and had a daughter of her own, that daughter was suicidal her whole life and finally got cancer and died at almost exactly the same age as the grandmother. So I said, sometimes it skips a generation, but just like her grandmother, she was being just like her grandmother for her mother. If your mother died, here, I'll be the one who dies so your mother can be okay. Now that doesn't work. There was another man we worked with he said, I feel like I'm at war with myself. Well, he was half Japanese, half American. His mother was Japanese and had actually lived through the Second World War. His father had been in the United States Navy and fought against the Japanese and was actually on one of the ships that delivered one of the atomic bombs to the plane. And so that man carried a huge amount of guilt. And so our client had half of his father who had been at war and half of his mother who had been on the receiving end. And he was in constant conflict, not consciously. Again, we don't do this consciously. There's another book, Jan I have it here, Jan Varner wrote a book called Nothing to Burn. And in it, he talks about his grandfather. His grandfather was a serial arsonist, just set fires all over the place, terrible fires. So that was his grandfather. His father then became fire chief. And he, the author, Jay Varner, he became a reporter, and he was assigned to the police fire beat. So that's a less damaging way that this played out, but they were still following a pattern in less destructive ways, which that part's good. So how this shows up in relationship, it can happen in so many ways. I once had a woman come who to work with me because she said, I have no boundaries in relationship. Well, when we got to the family history, she was actually the product of a rape. Someone had raped her mother. And so she actually owed her existence to a violation of boundaries. So it put her in an interesting conflict. If she had boundaries the way her mother didn't have, then she wouldn't exist. A very interesting conflict that she wasn't even aware of until we started looking into this. I work with so many adopted people who, because they've been given away by their parents, and it doesn't matter why the parents gave them away, they basically feel unwanted. And so they often make sure that no one else will want them either. Or they live their lives as though no one would ever want them. But quite often they're being loyal to their parents. If you didn't want me, no one else will want me. And an adoptive child can be raised in a terribly loving environment and then still replay the fate of their biological parents, even if they don't know the stories, even if they don't know the facts. It's stunning how many people I find out only after the fact do they realize their parent had the same experience. Pulled to addiction, suicide. I worked with another man who really wanted a relationship, but when we found out what was in the way, his father had served in the Second World War, and this is coming up a lot, in the Second World War, in the Battle of the Bulge. And it was one of those nights when there was incredibly heavy shelling, and he and his foxhole buddy were in the foxhole when a shell came in, and his buddy right next to him took a direct hit. And so the only reason my client's father didn't die was because it was such a direct hit that his buddy's body absorbed all the impact. But that man felt so guilty for being alive, and my client was carrying the same guilt about being alive. When we revised that, within a few months, he found the relationship he'd been looking for. He got married, and they had a child. There was another woman who was always a victim in relationships. It turned out her grandfather, not her great-grandfather, was a serial killer. And so she was unconsciously identifying with his victims, trying to make it better for him by remembering them. But there are two most common ways it shows up. One is our parents' relationship, because first off, that's our model for love and relationship. And secondly, we often replay that so that we don't have it better than they did. Not just because that's what we know, but also because if it was bad for them, we'll make it bad for us. Again, nobody signs up for this consciously, but unconsciously, it's there. It's there in so many of our lives, and we don't even know it. This is actually one of the biggest blocks that people have to love, money, health, and happiness. But the other most common way it shows up is something that's called an interrupted reaching out. Because energetically, as soon as a child comes into the world, they start energetically reaching out to their parents. Now, in the best case scenario, the parents can reach back, but quite often the parents can't or won't, and if they won't, it's because they can't reach back. And so the hurt and the terror and the despair of that are so extreme that the child withdraws, and then at a certain point, they're not willing to reach again. So they might later meet somebody when they're grown and ready for a relationship, meet someone who wants to reach to them, but they're afraid to reach again. And that fear of reaching again shows up as anger and distance. These are the two most common ways that it shows up for people in relationship. Basically, there is really only one reason ever that we don't have the relationship we want. Only one. It's not that we're too fat, too thin, too ugly, too poor, too unsuccessful, too needy, to fill in the blank. The only reason we don't have a relationship ever is because we don't want one. Now, usually the parts of us that don't want it, though, are not the parts we're aware of. We're aware of the parts of us that want it. But there's almost always another part. If we don't have it, it's because there's a part of us, and often the voting majority part of us doesn't want it. So let's see some of what can actually cause these family entanglements, in case some of these sound familiar, or these tragic events. See, let's hear some of what they are. They can cause people to not have the experience they want. So, did anyone in your family die young or tragically? And when we say family, we mean your brothers and sisters, your parents, their brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles, your grandparents, their brothers and sisters, and even great-grandparents and their brothers and sisters. Sometimes it goes further back. If it's a really big tragedy, it may go even further back. So did anyone die young or tragically? Did anyone commit suicide? Or lose a parent as a young child? Did anyone die or suffer a trauma in childbirth? Fight in or die in a war? Oops, sorry. We are there, right? Sorry. Die or suffer a trauma in childbirth, fight in, die in, or avoid a war. Lose a love or a fortune. Suffer a major disability. Did anyone kill anyone, rescue anyone, or get rescued by someone? Or commit a crime? Did anyone have an illegitimate child? Because in previous generations, and still some places in the world, this was a very big and very big deal and very difficult. Did anyone have a former spouse? Either someone that they divorced or who died? And again, we're talking parents, grandparents, great-grandparents. Did anyone have an abortion? Did anyone survive a tragedy, like the Holocaust or a natural disaster? Did anyone emigrate from another country? Because in previous days, this was a big deal. You couldn't, their contact was limited. You were leaving behind all your support, often your culture, your language, your history. Or was anyone institutionalized or imprisoned? Was anyone given up for adoption? Or disowned or excluded for any reason? Was anyone homosexual? That was a very big deal and usually hidden in previous times, and still in many places in the world today. Was anyone an alcoholic or an addict? And was anyone mentally ill? These are some of the conditions that create unconscious entanglements. And some of the worst things in families, unfortunately, we don't even know about because nobody talked about them, or they were hidden or hushed up. We had a joke. I was teaching a class in how to facilitate constellations, and I was doing the history, and I was asking all these questions. And this one guy said, no, none of that. We're all pretty normal. Well, then we set up the constellation, and what the constellation showed was an entirely different story. So much death, depression, and insanity. So that became kind of a joke for a while. Oh, we're pretty normal. And you know what? Sadly, that is pretty normal. We're all descended from victims of great crimes. We're all descended from perpetrators of one kind or another. We're all descended from struggle, from war, poverty, starvation, disease, hardship, cruelty, enslavement, persecution, tragedy, and loss. Lost loves, lost countries, lost fortunes, lost children, lost parents, lost culture, lost health and sanity. All of these can be found in all of our family history if you go back far enough. Now, the really far back stuff often doesn't affect us. But if you're not having the life or the love or the health or the money you want, it's quite possible that you are what's called entangled in some of these generational effects. We carry the losses of the past with us in ways that we're rarely aware of. We feel them as unconscious pain, and we identify with them outside of our conscious awareness as unconscious loyalties. And then we wonder, why can't I find a relationship? Why can't I make money? Why do I always feel so sick and tired? And quite often, this is the reason why. And ironically, the drive behind much of the worst suffering is love. Love and the desire to belong. Love and the desire to make it better for people, and the desire to belong. Because as human beings, the drive to belong to our families is so incredibly strong. People will die to belong. Otherwise, war wouldn't be possible. And people feel their belonging most strongly when they are like the people they come from. We often compute our belonging in its crudest terms, in that of conformity. So when we're like the people that we're with or that we come from, we feel like we belong. And when we're not like the people that we come from, we often feel like we don't belong. And so quite often, outside of our conscious awareness, we are trying to belong by suffering or by not belonging because somebody in the family didn't belong. I will belong like you by not belonging. It's hard to make sense of consciously, but it's astonishing how much of this is behind the places where we're stuck. And so to avoid this feeling of guilt, of having it better, most people unconsciously limit the amount of good fortune and well-being and happiness that they let show up in their lives. It shows up, as I said, across the board in so many ways, and the effects are so prevalent. I get so many requests from constellations that I could be doing a constellation or two every single night and still not get them all done. And so because of that, because there is such a desire for this and such a need, and because it has such dramatic effects when these things change and resolve and shift in the way that we can in this kind of work, I got frustrated with not being able to help everyone. So this was one of my main drives in creating Clear Path to Love. It's a workshop that allows me to work with an entire group of people. It's limited to either 24 to 30 people so that everybody has a good experience. But it lets me do this kind of work on a larger scale because there's just not enough time to do a constellation for everybody who wants and needs ones. So using this work, which is traditional constellation work, and then some adaptations of the work to a group format so that everybody can participate, this lets us get this done. So here's what happens in Clear Path. Here's what you get to experience, because everybody gets to experience this. Whoops, sorry. I'm coming right back. Still working out the bugs. Everybody gets to discover their unconscious. There you can see, this was a new slide. Everybody gets to discover their unconscious energy to relationship. Everybody gets to see what they're putting out there. Everybody gets to shift their patterns around relationship and love. Everyone gets to learn about give and take in relationship. Also, everybody gets to see how their parents' relationship is affecting them. This in itself is a huge thing. And then everyone gets to begin to release generational patterns. Sorry, these are not finished. But I wanted to have you to be able to see these. Everybody gets to discover the strength of their own gender, and everybody gets to experience being supported by the generations of your family rather than limited by them. Everybody gets to participate. Everybody gets to see at least some of what's in the way of them and having the love that they want. So I recently ran into someone who had been in a recent Clear Path, and she was now in a relationship and so happy about it. And she said, I give all the credit to that workshop. And the most recent one we did, there was a fellow in there in a very difficult relationship. And as soon as the workshop ended, so did the relationship. And then right under his nose, he discovered the relationship he actually wanted. And he's now in that, and he's so happy. We had another woman, we had so many people who haven't been in a relationship in years who come to the workshop, and within the next year, they're in a really good relationship, the kind that they've always wanted. The examples of that are huge. We had another couple who were breaking up. They actually did break up, and they said, well, let's go try this workshop. And after the workshop, I wouldn't say that they went back to the relationship, because they didn't go back to the relationship, but things shifted so that they could have the relationship in a new way that felt good to both of them. We had another man who discovered in the workshop that he'd been holding himself back so that he could be there for his mother. And when he let that go, he said, wow, I actually feel ready for a relationship. One of my favorite parts about Clear Path is at the end of the workshop, seeing the way people look. They look like different people, they glow. There is something about when they let go of those generational patterns of limitation. I get goosebumps even now, I just got them, because they start to have the lives that they came here to live. Instead of trying to futilely fix the past, they start to live in the present and future that they came here to create. And the looks on people's faces at the end of that workshop, and everybody sees it, they look around and it's like, wow, they look like different people. They look like the happiest, most relaxed versions of themselves. And that's why I keep wanting to do this, seeing them so much lighter, so much happier. We don't come here to change past tragedies. We come here to create new possibilities. That's where our gifts and our love and our creativity and our potential can actually have an effect. That's where we live life. Every one of us who steps out of the past, who lets go of the generational patterns and steps into the present, not only lets the past tragedies be over, but frees them up to create new and better lives, beautiful lives, lives with love. Every one of us has the chance to live lives that are freer and happier, and that's our wish for everyone. And you can't be free if you don't know what's in the way of you having what you want. And so this is one of the best ways I've found to be able to find out what's in the way and resolve it and free up our energy, our love, our potential in our lives. I know it wasn't until I gave up trying to heal, carry my family pain and heal it, that I found the relationship that I wanted. And I'm so much happier because of it. Human beings thrive when they are in loving relationships in many ways, with a partner, with their families, with friends, with coworkers. This is when human beings thrive. We are social animals. We do not do well in isolation. And so every person who starts to let that go and step into love in the ways that they always wanted to, lives a better life and impacts the people around them in really beautiful ways. Sadly, all the ways we keep ourselves stuck because we're hoping to make it better for someone else, it only makes it worse for us. But when we make it better for us, the better it gets for each one of us, the better it gets for all of us. So we would love to see you at Clear Path or one of our relationships. I'll stay on. I'm going to end this and I'll start up again with some Q&A so that you can ask some questions, or you can chat them in right now and I'll get to them as I can. Thank you so much. Wishing you all good things and a better present and future. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording.